So now that we know how complicated life is, how could life have developed on Earth? So the first thing that we're going to have to do is get the raw materials, so the raw organic materials that life is composed of. And so we need to assemble those organic materials from inorganic materials. And so examples of inorganic materials would be water, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, and sulfur dioxide. So those are all things that tend to come out of volcanoes and also tend to be found in comets. So there was an original experiment done in which they took a glass flask and they put inside of it water, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide. So they put these raw ingredients inside of this glass thing, and then they struck it with electricity, and they also gave it some ultraviolet light because they figured that the early Earth would have had lots of lightning strikes and there would have been a lot of radiation coming in from the sun. And then after a while, they started noticing this brown stuff in the bottom of the glass flask, and that brown stuff was composed of organic materials. So it was composed of amino acids and sugars, things that make up life. They did not make life, but what they did make was the raw ingredients that makes up life. Then later they found out that a underwater smoker, so this is an underwater volcano, which gives off these raw materials into the water. They found out that there would be chemical reactions that would take place that again would manufacture these sugars and amino acids. So that would occur right next to an underwater volcano. And again, this is not life, but it is creating the raw materials that you need for life. And then later, they even found that on comets and on asteroids, there are, again, these organic materials can be found. So it's not really that difficult to make the raw materials that life is composed of. But that's not life. So the next thing that we've got to do is we're going to take these nucleic acids and we're going to string them together to make RNA. And then somehow this RNA is going to fold itself up and turn it into a protein. Okay, now we said, let's just talk about bacteria. So if we go back to this picture here, in a typical bacteria, let's say 500 nucleic acids. So we need to string together 500 nucleic acids in order to make the simplest workable protein in a bacteria. And they have to be exactly correct, or else this protein's not going to work. Now, for each of these nucleic acids, it turns out that there are 4 possible nucleic acids that can fit for each one of these things. So you could have 4 possibilities for position number 1. Then you could have 4 possibilities for position number 2. Then you could have 4 possibilities for position number 3. Now remember that we've got 500 of these things, so that would be 4 raised to the 500th power. So that is the total number of combinations possible whenever you start stringing these things together. And I said that if just one of these things is incorrect, then the whole protein is not going to work. So what is the odds that you are going to be able to string together 500 of these things in exactly the correct order so that it's going to fold up and make the simplest protein possible? Not very likely. But here's the idea that biologists have come up with. They clay is a very sticky substance. And so these nucleic acids, which were just kind of floating around in the water after they had been created by some inorganic mechanism, one of them would land on the clay, and then another one that's floating around is going to land right next to it, and then the two of them are going to hook together. And then another one is going to land, and it's going to get hooked, so you're going to make a giant conga line of these nucleic acids. And hopefully you get 500 of them that work. Well, chances of that happening are very, very low. But what they think is that this was occurring trillions and trillions of times in the primeval oceans. So that it wasn't just one string that was being formed. You had trillions and trillions and trillions of strings that were all being formed at the same time, and chances are that one of these trillions and trillions of times it worked. So you might have heard about a story about if you take a 1,000 monkeys and you give them typewriters and you give them 1,000 years of just randomly hitting the keys, they would create Shakespeare. Okay, so the idea is if you've got enough time and you've got enough of these things happening, chances are one of them is going to start to work eventually. So then, once you get your string, the string folds into a protein. Proteins develop into these chemical machines that can carry on chemical reactions. And then later, RNA developed DNA. So the original materials that was used in living organisms was RNA. And then later, DNA was invented as a storage mechanism for this. Okay, then the next thing that we're going to have to do is we have to take all of these chemical reactions and put them inside of a cell. Now this part is not that difficult. All right, this part here, so if we go back to this is not that difficult to do. This is incredibly difficult to do. This part is not so difficult to do because if you have mixed oil and water together, you notice that they always tend to separate and they make layers. So it's possible that when you mix lipids, which are fats, with water, they tend to make these spherical shells and they tend to separate themselves. And this would have formed the earliest kind of cell membrane. Okay, then the next thing is various kinds of chemical reactions need to be established in these biological organisms. So two of the most important ones are photosynthesis, which takes place in the chloroplast, and then respiration, which takes place in the mitochondria. So in photosynthesis, we said carbon dioxide and water and sunlight go together to make organic materials. And then in respiration, organic materials are broken down and turned into carbon dioxide and water and energy. So those are two very, very simple chemical reactions. Well, I just wanted to show you this, that this is all of the different kinds of chemical reactions that takes place inside of your body. And you can see that these chemical reactions, which are called a metabolic pathway, can get very, very complicated. So even in the simplest kind of bacteria, it has many, many different kinds of chemical reactions going on. So again, this would be very hard to establish. And then lastly, let's talk about how did a bacteria evolve into a cell that has multiple organelles. And so one way that they think that this could have happened is that you start with a bacteria that has a cell wall, and then it has its DNA inside of it like this that is not enclosed in anything. And then it also has these ribosomes. So these are really the most important parts to a bacterium. So they think that maybe this cell membrane could start to fold in on itself, and then by doing so, it started to make first a structure that surrounded the DNA, and then that became the nucleus. And then some of these other membranes started to cover the nucleus, and then that's where the ribosomes began to live. Okay, but then what about things like the mitochondria, the power plant? So how did the mitochondria get inside of the cell? So what they think is that originally the mitochondria was a type of bacteria. It was a very advanced type of bacteria that was capable of carrying on very, very complicated chemical reactions. And it was a power plant. And then what happened was that this large cell ate this cell here. So it incorporated it, but instead of digesting it, what it did was it kind of enslaved it. Now, this was mutually beneficial though, because from the point of view of the bacteria, it's a really good thing to be living in here because you're protected and you're being fed, because this cell is constantly feeding food to this bacteria right here. Now, from the point of view of the bacteria, of this thing, having the bacteria in there is a good thing, because all this thing has to do is feed it, and then this thing provides all the energy that the rest of the cell needs. So this is a mutually beneficial situation for this bacteria to be living inside of this cell. Later, this bacteria starts to lose its ability to reproduce outside of this cell here. And so it turns into an organelle. They think the same thing happened with another bacteria over here, but this bacteria specialized in taking light and then turning it into food. And so this was a photosynthetic bacteria. And then when it got incorporated into the cell, it became a chloroplast. And then this thing became a plant cell when that happened. So this is how cells could have become more and more complicated. Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about the geological and biological history of the Earth.